Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi, my name is Lily, and I enjoy listening to your podcast. Could you please do a podcast or article on the scientific base behind the NS, FT, and JP cognitive functions, or point me in the direction of material that discusses research pertaining to this? The only part of Myers Briggs that is valid scientifically that I know of is the introvert or extrovert divide, and I have read resources that deal with the brain in that regard. How could this material be valid scientifically, not personally or socially, if it has no basis in truth? Note, I do understand why this material is valuable in other ways. I am simply looking for data that pertains to this topic. Thank you, Lily.
What I love about this question is that I think a lot of people have this particular question in their mind as a barrier of entry into type, into all models, actually. Any model or map that doesn't seem to have, I almost want to say like the full force of, say, the psychological field or the full force of any of the sciences behind it, if it tends to be something that's like out of fashion or it doesn't have massive credibility behind it, I think we tend to wonder if that thing in and of itself is false. Because wouldn't the psychology or psychological field, if it was true, wouldn't they immediately adopt it? And on top of that, the question is, how much faith do we put into concepts that are abstractions, like typology? Like, are we going to go ahead and say that they're empirically true, even though we don't necessarily have proof for it? Or, like, how? And if we don't have proof for it, is it something we shouldn't put any faith in or have any, belief around? I think that those are all extremely valid questions, especially since concepts like faith and belief become really convoluted in amongst things that are specifically unscientific. So I think when we're answering this question, I think we need to create some definitions around the terms that are natural parts of this question, which are, is this a scientific field? Is it an unscientific field? Is there any proof for any of this? And if not, then why are we engaging in the conversation to begin with?
Yeah, sometimes I feel like around typology, I feel like Benjamin Franklin experimenting with electricity, in the 1700s, where he was attempting to discover something. He was in a scientific process of understanding and discovery, and people were arguing about, could electricity be harnessed? Is this something we can use? And there was really no use for it. It was a really embryonic field, and people were just starting the process of understanding how to harness a power and go through the scientific process and method to understand electricity, 200 and some odd years ago. And when we talk about scientific method, there's this idea that you're doing some test iterate. You come up with a hypothesis, you do some research, you think you might be right, so you do some testing, you see if your hypothesis was correct at all, and you do some more testing, and you continually refine those processes, and eventually you come to some conclusions, some results based on that. And I would posit the question really isn't, is this scientific? It's, where are we in the chain of understanding this scientifically?
Right, exactly. So it's for something to be scientific, it has to, science is basically the study of observable nature. We create instruments to be able to measure things to determine their accuracy and truth. And that's the point of science. The point of science is to try to get down to the fact level, not even the truth level. I would say the fact level. Do you remember in Indiana Jones where in the third movie in Last Crusade, Indiana Jones goes, hey, we're talking about fact in this course. If you want to talk about truth, so-and-so professor's philosophy course is right down the hall. And so science is the attempt to understand facts, like irrefutable facts. And that's why it goes through so many test iterates. Something to be scientific, it has to follow the scientific method, which is, ask a question, do some research, come up with a hypothesis, experiment, analyze your experiment, and then if it's true, it progresses to a result, right? Like you make it goes from hypothesis to, I believe this is what is going on. And if the analysis of the experiment is wrong, then it goes back into the question phase, or goes back into the hypothesis phase, or even pre-hypothesis. Or research, basically. So that's the scientific method. And for something to follow science, it has to be observing the scientific method. If something is unscientific, it means that it's ignoring that method. It means that it's making, conclusions based on very little information, or it's ignoring conclusions that have already been through the scientific method. Like, we pretty well established that the Earth is round right now. And if we just go, nope, sorry, it's flat, that is an unscientific conclusion. So science is following the scientific method and, creating instruments to observe nature. And the unscientific, or something that is unscientific, is something that ignores that entire process. But what's interesting is that we have a lot of stuff that it's either going counter to that, or not counter, but going meta on that. Abstractions that have no instruments yet to measure them. We have lots of fields that are concepts and I would say universal beliefs that at this time can't be put through the scientific method. Like this concept of love. We are forever trying to create instruments that can measure love. And yet love is an abstraction that can't really be measured at this time. So do we think that love is unscientific? Well, no, it's just not something that we can come to any very specific conclusions about, except that we all recognize its existence and engage with it on a daily basis. So I would actually argue that those concepts, those abstractions, are put in the realm of philosophy, right? They're not necessarily specifically scientific yet, because they can't go through the scientific method. They're not unscientific. They're not ignoring current science. So they go sort of meta of the whole scientific world, and they get put into the concepts of philosophy. So now that we've defined all of these terms and these concepts around science, then you take something like the Myers Briggs personality typology system, which is what the person asking the question specifically was asking about: the dichotomies, introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and judging and perceiving. And she was saying, introversion and extroversion, there's some burgeoning scientific evidence or backing for this concept. Like we have sophisticated enough instruments to indicate that there might be some scientific backing to introversion and extroversion being, and what I read is, because I kind of keep up with this stuff, the burgeoning evidence indicates that it might be wrapped into our DNA. Like it might be something that we come out of the hatch with. So what's fascinating though is that the concepts around introversion and extroversion massively predate the instruments we have now that we are able to measure this concept with. And so you were even mentioning before, Joel, that a pattern recognizer would say...
Yeah, you would say, okay, well, if this research coming out for introversion, extroversion, we're starting to see some patterns and some instruments to measure this, it's probably a matter of time before we're able to measure some of the other dichotomies that you mentioned, Lily, and... give it some time, be patient, because we have a belief here at Personality Hacker that those instruments will eventually come down the pike. In fact, there are people doing brain scan research and other ways of measuring some of these things right now. They're very embryonic, but give it 20, 30, 40 years, and it probably will be something that is very well researched, very well understood, and very well measured.
Yeah, these instruments are so new. Like neuroscience is such a relatively new field. I mean, all of science really is relatively new if you think about it, considering how long we've been around on the planet. The scientific method is not very old in and of itself. So a lot of these instruments are coming down the pike, and we're trying to make better and better instruments, but like you mentioned, all of the instruments that in and of themselves are pretty embryonic. So we're trying to get better at it. We're trying to figure out ways to measure these things that have always been in the realm of abstractions, and we are getting more sophisticated at it, and we are probably going to get to a point where, our suspicion is we are going to be able to measure these elements. Until we're at that point, though, I'm totally perfectly comfortable in saying until it's at a point where, it's gone through the rigor of the scientific method and it has passed into conclusion level, until we're at that point, I'm totally fine with it being philosophy. That doesn't bother me in the least. There are so many things that I even if they are concepts that are, held with a lot of esteem in the scientific community, I still kind of see them as philosophy, because we don't actually truly know them to be true. What's really fascinating is I was recently on a Reddit thread. Reddit is a news aggregate site online, reddit.com, reddit.com. And there was a really interesting thread that was talking about Wikipedia articles, that if you keep asking the question why, or if you keep, fundamentally, no matter what Wikipedia page you fall on, if you keep clicking on the source materials and keep going back further and further into the source materials and basically asking why all the way back, every single Wikipedia article eventually will end up on the Wikipedia page about philosophy. Every single one. It's like, there's like some, I don't think it's a rule yet, but it was like somewhere around 11 to 17 clicks back, no matter what you're talking about. I mean, you could be talking about fire hydrants, like something very concrete, tangible. But eventually, if you keep clicking the source material, you will end up on the page called philosophy. And that's such a great illustration of sort of my take on reality in and of itself. Like, it doesn't matter how concrete the conversation is. It doesn't matter like how definitive we think the material reality, concrete reality of our statement is. If you keep going back to the why, right, you're eventually going to hit a point where you're like, well, I don't know it to be true. We know this as a parent of a 3-year-old. Piper's just about to be 3 years old, and she is in her perpetual why phase. Louis C.K. has this great bit in his stand-up called Hilarious, where he basically talks about his child asking why on every statement he's making. You know, why? And eventually he's like, because that is what is known. What cannot be. Like, he's like just fumbling because she's asking such existential questions at a certain point. Like, the question of why becomes so existential and so philosophical at a certain point, because the answer is we don't actually know anything to be empirically true. These are our best guesses. So, Not to indicate that personality typology is something that you should have faith in because we can't know anything to be true. It's more that if it's not necessarily firmly scientific right now, which it can't be because we don't yet have the instruments to measure its truthfulness or factfulness yet. But it's not unscientific. It's not going against the scientific method. It's still kind of in the hypothesis, test, iterate, experiment phase. So, and it's not going against any specific scientific principles. So it's not unscientific. Then it falls in the realm of philosophy. And then if anything falls in the realm of philosophy, as far as I'm concerned, is the big questions then become, is it useful? Does it promote happiness? Does it promote health? Is it useful for you as an individual in promoting your own happiness and the happiness of the people around you? And if it passes those questions, then the answer is it's a useful model. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to use it, even if it hasn't necessarily been definitively scientifically proven.
So a couple of things that come up for me, just to, I guess, wrap it up, and you can say a couple more things too, Antonia, about this. One is, as we're going through this, you mentioned the fact that introversion, extraversion, it's burgeoning. We're seeing some actual evidence, some scientific evidence. Lily mentioned that in her comment. And somebody pattern recognized this. Some intuitive or someone with a lot of intuition at some point pattern recognized this way before we had the instrument to measure it. And so I would suggest, if you're listening, that trust your intuition a little bit more, that you probably have, if you're pattern recognizing something, there'll probably be an instrument to measure what you're seeing come up in whatever model or framework you're studying or working with at the time. And if it feels like it's probably right, keep going down that, pursue that. I mean, within reason, but there's probably going to be an instrument to measure that at some point. And the other thing that comes up for me, and maybe we can have a quick little discussion, I don't want to take too much more time because I think we've really answered the question fully to the point that I feel satisfied. But it's interesting to see this seems to be the resistance a lot with personality typology or any type of framework or model is, well, show me scientific evidence or I'm not going to be using this. And I think that comes up a lot for people, and that's where we work with students that'll go through our profiler training course. They'll have mastered the material, and then they go and they talk to friends and family, and their friends and family feel so dismissive toward them because it's like, well, that's just not scientific. It's a bunch of hogwash, blah, blah, blah. Why do people have to be so dismissive, and using the scientific card toward being dismissive would be the question I would ask. And have you asked yourself, if you're listening, why do you think people are being so dismissive around that? Because in my mind, like Antonia said, science is the best thing. A lot of the scientific method is the best thing we have right now to understand reality. But that doesn't mean that we actually understand reality. I mean, holding loosely to everything that we understand to be true is helpful because then we don't get over-attached. We don't get too bought into something to where we can't be flexible later and change our minds and be I don't know, palatable might be the wrong word, but palatable, where we can be maneuverable, we can switch, we can form ourselves to some new understandings and grow, and we don't limit ourselves because of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, the first time I hear information that a model of mine is definitively unscientific and is clearly unhealthy to believe, not that that's happened because I'm pretty, I go through a pretty hardcore vetting process internally with the models and maps that I use. But if that were to happen, I would have no problem throwing it out. Like, these models and maps are only meant to increase our personal development process and our happiness and the happiness of the people around us. So if something is discouraging that process, then let go. Like, if Myers Briggs is, not helping you, then you don't serve the model serves you. I think that's basically what Lily was saying, is she was saying, well, if it's, I understand how it's helpful in other ways, but is it scientific? And the question is, well, it's not unscientific. And it's still in the, experiment hypothesis phase of the scientific method. So I would actually argue, considering that it's in that phase, I would argue that it's actually rather scientific because we're still hypothesizing about it. It hasn't been proven wrong, and we're still developing instruments to try to prove it right. That question about why are people so dismissive when they say things like, well, it's not scientific. I think that we do that anytime there's a model that we're not familiar with and comfortable with, forgetting that all of us hold beliefs that could not be called scientific. I think we forget that about ourselves. I think we have this tendency to believe that everything that we believe, that everything we think is empirical reality, and everything everybody else believes, if it crosses our concept of empirical reality, is somehow bullshit. And I think it's a rationalization to protect our worldview, honestly.
Yeah, and when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, here's the final thing I'll say, and I think we can wrap up, is all these people, or anyone that says, well, this, Myers-Briggs personality typology, or any framework of personality understanding is not scientific, so I dismiss it. You forget that everybody on the planet is personality profiling people all the time anyway. In fact, one of the first exercises we have our profiler training students do is we have them list all the ways that people in their lives are profiling others and how they're profiling others with whatever model they're using. It might be, female versus male, or, socioeconomic status, or race, or whatever people are, how they're categorizing people. We're already doing it. Yeah. We've already built frameworks and models. So why not try to get a little more sophisticated and put some language and some structure around how we see people? And just that alone, to me, gives validity to a lot of personality systems, because it gives us frameworks for things that we are already doing as humans anyway, and everybody does it. I don't care who you are. You're categorizing people, just going through your day.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think just the last thing that I'd like to say is, I touched on it earlier, I think it's worth noting, is that the Myers-Briggs system it's not the model du jour for the psychology field. They prefer models like DISC. That DISC is also called other acronyms. And one of the reasons why they have a preference for models like DISC is that it's based on behavior. The DISC model is based specifically on behavior. So behavior is something that's observable. And so it feels more scientific because your science is based on observing nature. So that feels like it has more credibility to it. And I think because the field of psychology is already such a soft science, and we don't have sophisticated instruments yet. Like, they're getting more sophisticated, but we are not at a point where we can truly, truly map the mind. Like, we're not there yet. We'll be there, but we're not there yet. So I think there's a bit of insecurity in the field of psychology because 60 years ago, people were completely dismissing it as a field altogether. Like, it was all hocus pocus and hoodoo magic. So the field of psychology has itself had a major, they've had a major a hump to get over with people dismissing this concept of whether or not psychology is scientific. So I think there might be a little bit, like within the field itself, a little bit of insecurity woven in, that they don't want to adopt a model too early if it's not something that they can establish some credibility around, which is completely understandable. But I don't know if I would necessarily use that as an indicator of something's accuracy or truthfulness. And especially, again, I put it in the realm of philosophy, so especially if it's helping you out, it's not like you have to necessarily have an entire field that's like cheerleading you on. Now, if an entire field is saying it's unscientific and giving you definitive proof for its lack of scientific, validity, that is definitely something to, you don't want to just believe something that is egregiously unscientific because you just want to hold on to that belief. So there's like a fine line. And I think really the key here, whenever you're going to look at a model like this, is to ask yourself, how much practice have you put your mind through in vetting information to begin with? Because using your intuition to guide you in something that we don't have instruments yet to measure, using your mind to vet information, this is something that you have to do all the time with a million different things a day. So really what you should be, I think the best way to prevent yourself from, sort of being taken for a ride, so to speak, in some map or model that's not useful or not healthy or not helpful, is to, make sure that you're not a person who is, I guess, being sort of mentally lazy about cognitive biases or outsourcing most of your opinions to other people. You should have a daily mental exercise or a regime to ensure that you're being a critical thinker. You don't have to be skeptical of everything. I don't believe that that's necessarily healthy. And I don't think that you have to be, optimistic about everything. There's a phrase called an infophile or an infophobe. An infophile is somebody who loves all new information, and an infophobe would be somebody who dismisses all new information. And you don't want to be either of those. You don't want to assume every piece of information that comes in is great and wonderful and it's a fantastic thing. And you don't want to assume that every piece of information you're getting is complete and utter BS. You want to find yourself in there doing authentic critical thinking and really measuring your concepts against your personal health and the health of the people around you and other markers, right? Other personal markers that are, increasing and improving the quality of your life and yourself as a person. So I think my final thought on this concept would be, it's really about making sure that you're using your mind as a finely tuned instrument, that you are improving your intuition and your pattern recognition for things that have a tendency to, to manifest as closer to fact or truth. And then when you're using a model like the Myers Briggs system, to recognize that just because it's not scientifically proven at this point doesn't mean it is unscientific, but rather it's still going through the scientific method. And maybe at one point we'll have instruments that allow us to measure it.
Thank you for the question. If you want to ask a question for us here at Personality Hacker, visit our website, personalityhacker.com. You can also join our growing community of like minds just like you over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. We'd love to hear from you and have you join that community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk to you on the next PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community.